every year, for the last number of years, we have organized an event in honor of our former president and chairman, Fred Lafer. Sometimes Fred gets caught in traffic and is a little late. Sometimes usually Fred is sitting right here in the front row with Barbara. Regrettably, Fred can't be here this evening, although Fred and one of his children, Gordon, are together watching tonight's events on the live streaming that we now do for all Washington Institute events. They're watching it from the hospital where Fred is getting treatment. So we want to say, first and foremost, a welcome and reach out to Fred. And I'd like to welcome the members of Fred Lafer's family who are here with us this evening and ask them to rise, please. Barbara Lafer, Deborah and Howard Scher, and Diana Lafer. Please, thank you very much for being here this evening. Fred Lafer was the Institute's third president, and therefore its third chairman of the board. He is a vital cog in the leadership of our organization. I remember fondly when I was a much younger man and had just become director of the organization, and Fred was the president of the organization. Fred was absolutely instrumental in helping our organization transition from a small, niche, almost mom and pop operation to, well, we are now a mature, full-grown, major player in the Washington policy scene. And as you will see from the video that we're about to show you, to a great extent, that achievement, the growth, success of the Washington Institute has been and remains a function of the enormous contributions of Fred Lafer. So with that, if I can ask you to take a look at this video.
Fred is a remarkable person. Fred is a visionary and a practical person, all wrapped up into one.
He has been my partner for 59 years.
He's a prince of a guy, and he's one of my favorite people.
The Washington Institute has been an important focus in Fred's life for over 20 years. Fred has helped to shape the character of the Institute as it has helped shape his life.
9/11 had happened, the war in Iraq, the Second Intifada. These were three developments that really expanded the scope of the Institute. Suddenly, the Middle East went from being a sideshow of American foreign policy to the central arena. And Fred was able to help usher us into this new era.
Fred nurtured it. And really, to a great extent, thanks to him, we grew and blossomed into the mature organization that we are today.
When I first joined the Washington Institute, it seems like such a short time ago, but it was 19 years ago. Trying to get 25 people to a luncheon was a major success. But here we are, 500 of us. The Institute has grown, and we have achieved.
What has always impressed me about Fred has been his readiness to ask hard questions, his readiness to challenge assumptions, his readiness to do whatever is necessary to try to promote what's good for the country.
He won the admiration of those trustees on the left and on the right by his respectful listening to both sides.
Fred Lafer brings a dignity to the Institute. I mean, he's so clearly a gentleman and a scholar, and it comes across the very first moment you sit down and talk to him.
Fred is an extremely accomplished person in his own right. His background as both an attorney and a businessman give him a very, very serious and deep sense of the practical.
He made it a priority to meet individually and regularly with the young interns and research assistants in the office, believing it important to cultivate the next generation. But it was more than that.
You really sensed that this was a person who cared very deeply, not just about the welfare of the Institute, but of the people who worked there. It was very inspiring to see.
Fred is gentle and generous. He has deep insight and caring. Fred brings people together. Fred knows how to get the best out of people.
He often spoke about how much he learned from the Institute, soaking up facts and interpretations about the Middle East and his beloved Israel.
He is someone who is deeply passionate about trying to understand the character of the Middle East, but he's also deeply passionate about wanting to influence American policy. He's someone who is committed to the U.S.-Israeli relationship, but he's also committed to the U.S. doing well in the world.
Where is the next threat and the next problem, and what should the reaction be? If we're there with thoughtful work ahead of time, we can help the U.S.
There are very few people in my life who I've worked with who I have a higher regard for.
Very thoughtful, very, very smart.
He's a good friend and great counselor.
How blessed I feel to have journeyed through life with him.
His integrity really shines through.
We are lucky to have had Fred as a president, chairman, and leader of the Washington Institute.
Fred, you're here among friends. With that, I'd like to now turn to the second part of our evening, which is to focus on one of the most critical, one of the most troubling, one of the most important issues facing America in the Middle East today. And this is the situation in Syria. This is not a good news story. This is a story in which, regrettably, in my view, the good news options left us many months ago. And we are now facing a situation where the options are between bad and worse. In my view, the function of good policymaking is to help make the decisions between bad and worse, and to help bring about, for American interests and for global interests, the least bad situation possible. For the sake of the Syrian people, to be sure, but for the sake of everything else that we care about as well. I'm very delighted to welcome to the podium, and I'll ask them to come join me, His Excellency Zeid bin Raad, the permanent representative of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to the United Nations, and Ambassador James J. Jeffrey, the Philip Sollins Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute. Gentlemen, if I could ask you to come and join me, that would be great. You're in for a real treat, because these are two of my favorite people in the entire world. I first met Zeid Raad when we were both graduate students in England. We met over a pint in a restaurant in Cambridge. This is now about 25 years ago, or thereabouts. Since then, he's gone on to do great things. Zeid has served on the ground as with the peacekeeping mission in the former Yugoslavia. He has served his country as the permanent representative here in New York at the United Nations, first for 7 years, from 2000 to 2007. Then, for a vacation, he was sent to serve as Jordan's ambassador in Washington, which he served from, I think, 2007 to 2010. And then he was sent back here, recalled to serve once again as Jordan's representative to the UN, where he continues to serve today. That is more than a decade of nonstop service at the center of global decision-making. the Security Council, the United Nations, and in Washington, D.C. And Jordan, I can tell you, has been remarkably well served by having Zeid, Ambassador, His Highness Zeid bin Raad, in that position. I'm really delighted that you would join with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jim Jeffrey is really the finest that our Foreign Service produces. And I don't say that to everybody. Jim is a former Army veteran with service in Vietnam, who then went to the diplomatic service, rose through the ranks, served early in his career as ambassador in Albania, served in a very important role in dealing with the U.S. intervention in the former Yugoslavia, and then had an entire career in the Middle East. Served as U.S. ambassador in Turkey, U.S. ambassador in Iraq, and as the Deputy National Security Advisor throughout the Bush administration, with special responsibility for dealing with one small, pesky little issue, the challenge of Iran. Nobody knows the insides of dealing with the Iranians more than Jim Jeffrey, and his service in the field in Baghdad and Ankara and Iraq and Turkey gives him a special view. And along with Zeid, together we have people with a bird's eye view from three sides of the Syria issue. The Jordanian position, and then the American view looking in from Turkey and looking in from Iraq. This is really a special collection just among our two speakers this evening. So we have titled today's program, The Death of Syria, ? Implications for America and the Middle East. And I've asked each of our speakers to offer some remarks. This is an informal event, so there are no speeches to be given. To offer some remarks, and then we'll engage in what is the traditional Washington Institute custom of good questions, good discussion, and good exchange. Zeid, please. You can clap.
It's dangerous to clap before you've heard me speak. You know, Rob mentioned drinking a pint at a pub in the United Kingdom many years ago, back in the 14th century. Since I am a serving official from the Middle East, and this is being televised, I should add, and to borrow from Bill Clinton, while it is true that I did drink beer, I never swallowed it. The other point I'd like to make is how much I delight whenever I speak to a smaller audience, because when I first arrived in the United States, I was invited to go to Carnegie Mellon, and they have a huge hall there, and there's thousands of people. And so I got up on the stage and I started to speak, and there was a little voice off to the left of the stage. And as I'm speaking, without waiting for me to pause, this lady said to me, "Young man, speak louder." So I was completely thrown off, and I had to sort of gather myself, and I raised the volume. And as I'm speaking, she says, "We still can't hear you." And so by this stage, I've become a regimental sergeant major, and I'm bellowing. And she goes, "Young man, there's no need to shout to us," or shout at us. So I'm delighted to be with you here for this symposium. And I thought what I'd do is try and go beyond the conventional. As you all know, there are let's say three general themes written about when we examine Syria. And that is the threat posed to the region by virtue of the flow of people internally displaced that become refugees when they cross the international borders, the availability, or let's say the prevalence, of a large quantity of chemical agents, weapons, and so forth, and the third, the possibility of a broader sectarian conflict at play. The theme that sort of undergirds much of what we discuss is this general assumption that the economy of Syria is in such a state of deterioration that eventually the foreign currency reserves will run out. Whatever aid or support is extended to the government of Bashar al-Assad will eventually fizzle out, and that the end then will be near. And this exposes a sort of a lack of understanding, in my view, of how civil wars take on something else. And I'll get to that point in a moment. But first, just to cover the very do so very quickly, the issue of the refugees. Of course, it is extremely difficult now, and it is affecting the neighborhood in a manner that hitherto we thought we hopefully wouldn't be exposed to. Refugees total almost now 1.5 million, divided between 3 countries in the main: Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. In Jordan, the vast majority are living in families, with some in camps. The rate at which we're receiving them is anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 a night, so 60,000 a month. Every time we build a camp for 30,000, in 2 weeks it's filled. We not only have to provide the camp, but then you have to provide health services, education, and there has to be a modicum of security as well. In Lebanon, there are no camps, by and large, maybe some, but small. Everyone lives with the Lebanese hosts, the families that are there. And in Turkey, it's almost all camps, and very little live with families. So Turkey and Jordan are broadly similar in that respect, but we have a large number living. Actually, no, it's the reverse. We are not like the Turks. We have most living in families with us. The issue of the chemical weapons, I mean, it's broadly well known. In the beginning, we didn't have a fair appreciation of how many sites there were. We understood generally what the agents were. Some were binary as well. And we have now a much greater appreciation. I think we, when I say we, I mean the international community, of where these agents are and where the installations are, but not altogether a complete picture. And of course, that still leaves us worried. And then finally, the sectarian issues, as you well know, and you would have read, there was a great fear early on in the crisis that you would see movement on the Kurdish side, which will trigger then a series of events, chain reaction, if you will, and that would perhaps drag in Turkey and then lead to a broadening of the conflict, because then the Iraqis may feel that they need to respond and so forth. That, for the time being, has been allayed or put to rest, because Erdogan has pursued a policy with Öcalan of opening a new page or a chapter with the Kurds, and that, by and large, has calmed things down. Although we can go into more detail as to what all of that means. The thing that I would like to raise, though, with you, and this is where all the suppositions and calculations can be very much upset, is that the perennial winner in civil wars, and this is especially the case when the economy begins to tank and the institutions of state begin to collapse. The perennial winner, the gold medalist in any civil war, is the war profiteer, that oldest companion of war itself, the person who decides to smuggle, or the person who has already been smuggling weapons and fuel, and then begins to smuggle commodities of almost every nature. And what you find is that the criminal organization, or let's say the criminal networking within a state, begins to create a parallel shadow economy. And if the supposition exists that somehow, that when the foreign currency reserves are utterly depleted and the, let's say, Bashar al-Assad or others in the government cannot finance certain units within the military, or cannot find monies to finance the payroll of certain civil servants or services that are needed, what you tend to find is that in civil wars, that the monies become available, because actually there's plenty of it around. Now, one is aware, of course, that there are rumors that there have been sort of cash injections from outside of Syria, from two sources in particular, perhaps three. And one is aware, of course, that the inflation on various commodities is rising very fast. You see, I mean, extraordinary rise in price when it comes to baby foods. And we saw an article the other day in the New York Times about the availability of wheat, and that the price has jumped up. But what you tend to also find is that as this dark matter in civil war begins to take over, it creates sort of bladders where monies are available and credit is available, and cross-border cooperation is there, and guns turn up whether you don't expect them to turn up. And then you realize that things that could be smuggled are not just limited to sugar and wheat, but potentially, if you have a complete collapse and you have a mass movement of people, and the security guards that are guarding chemical weapons installations decide to flee, and it's chaotic and it's in disarray, then there is organization within the country that could be cross-sectarian, it could be cross-confessional, and things begin to move around. And so when you apply that sort of logic to what you have inside the country, the dangers to the rest of the region become very, very clear. And it's not just looking at one issue in isolation of everything else. Refugees, let's look at that and not look at the chemical weapons. Or the chemical weapons, let's look. It's if you tie it all together that you begin to then understand what this portends for our future in the region. And it could be, of course, exceedingly pernicious, exceedingly pernicious. The last point I'd like to just mention to you is one of the complications that we've suffered from is that there are so many moving parts in Syria. It's difficult for us to, I mean, it's difficult enough just to analyze Syria on a daily basis, but it's very difficult for us as governments in the region to also understand the whole board, not just to look at what happens in Syria and how it may affect Jordan or how it may affect Turkey or Lebanon or Israel, but how everyone could be affected, and then what are the potential slips that may occur. In other words, what are the chain reactions that may occur if we do X and they do Y, and then how are the Iraqis going to respond, and then what about the Iranians, and then what about... And this sort of appreciation, from my experience thus far, has not been forthcoming on the part of all of us. We have not sat there as a region and said, let's develop a common appreciation of the threats. If we all agree that we're all threatened, somehow, if this were to continue to escalate, then can we at least have a joint analysis of and an understanding which maybe lend to some sort of creative thinking when it comes to solving or containing this issue, or the Syrian crisis as it continues to boil. And this, I think, is the starting point that we must all endeavor to use before we leap into recipes for sorting out, as Rob said, a very, very complicated and now dangerous crisis. But I'll stop there, and I'll be happy for you to skewer me with difficult questions and comments if you'd like me to offer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim?
Mr. Gross, Rob, Mrs. Lafer, friends of the Washington Institute, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's an honor to be here. It's also a great pleasure to be back in New York. Although I'm a native Bostonian, I do have a certain fondness for your city, and it's good to be here. Sometimes when we have events like this, we strive to have two competing speakers who take different views. But I can't do anything but second what Prince Zeid has said. He's a man who knows the region and who knows the world. And I can do nothing other than to say that his idea of a comprehensive, joint appraisal and review of what's going on is absolutely necessary. What I'd like to do, apart from seconding what he has said about the dangers of the region, is to talk a little bit about how the United States does or could look at this conflict in the context of our overall foreign policy and what's going on in the Middle East, because a lot is going on there. First of all, the single biggest issue in the Middle East remains Iran. But whether you agree with it or not, the administration has a policy towards Iran and its nuclear weapons, and it's a relatively clearly enunciated one. We'll see how it works out, but and it has a big effect on Syria and Syria on it. But nonetheless, we do have a policy towards that. Syria, as Rob mentioned, is a particularly pressing problem, however, because of its centrality and the fact that it's not going away. And it calls on us to act now. And until we act, we are going to become the object of events, not the subject of them. And that's a bad place for America to be in, particularly right now in the Middle East. You all follow the Middle East. You know it's being shaken to its very roots by the Arab awakening. And what that means, many people have different views, but it clearly does not mean the same thing as the awakening of Eastern Europe in 1989. I was, among other things, in 1989 the advisor to Radio Free Europe, and this does not look at all like what was happening in Poland or Hungary or the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia. And in a situation like this, there is a need for leadership. I can't explain this because this is a gut feeling you just get in government in dealing with issues like the Balkans when they were hot, or the Middle East when it was hot, or the Soviet U.S.-NATO conflict when it was urgent, or Southeast Asia, that sometimes you have to take the lead before you know where every decision will take you. That's potentially risky, but just sitting and watching is risky too. And that's what I'm afraid that we may wind up doing if we don't act very quickly on this very pressing problem. Specifically, the U.S., rightly or wrongly, is seen as withdrawing from the region bit by bit. Withdrawal from Iraq, the upcoming large-scale withdrawal, if not complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, the pivot to Asia, or I guess we're now calling it a restructuring or a reset in Asia. The fact that America will soon be much less dependent on energy from the Middle East. Perhaps we will be much less, but we won't be fully independent. And the important thing is our allies and friends will not be independent of oil and gas from the Middle East. People also point out the American role in Libya. I actually was somewhat sympathetic to that because it was not a crucial central issue in the Middle East. Our allies could take the lead. They did take the lead. We did the necessary. That's not a bad model. But our lack of action in Syria is quite troubling and confusing to many of us. As you know, because it came out in congressional testimony very recently by Secretary Panetta as he was leaving, President Obama's top advisors recommended, reasonably, that we take certain steps, including arming and training the opposition. And the president was not ready to do that. I'll try to explain why I think he wasn't ready to do it, but I think that was a mistake. Secretary Kerry is showing a real enthusiasm for Middle Eastern problems. The peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. Iraq, he visited Iraq. He's been several times to Turkey, and Turkey's a key actor. He's going to be focusing on Syria in all of his talks. Meanwhile, the Secretary of Defense is going to be visiting the region as well. So we're seeing a new activism focused on the Middle East, and that's a good thing. The question is, in which direction is it going to take us, and are we going to be shaping events, or are we going to be letting events shape us? So far, as concerns Syria, they've been shaping us, and that isn't a good thing, because we're on the hook. President Obama has said that Assad must go and that Assad will go. On chemical weapons, he has said that it is unacceptable if they are used or fall into the hands of terrorists, and that there will be consequences. Given the state of chaos that I can just imagine in Syria, but having been in Iraq in 2004, I have a pretty good basis to imagine chaos. Sooner or later, those things are going to either be used verifiably, or they're going to fall into the wrong hands, and then we're going to find ourselves in one of those oh gosh moments where we have to act and put young men and women in harm's way without having really shaped the environment. We need to shape the environment beginning now. So, how can we do that? First of all, and here I'll draw from my friend Andrew Tabler and Dennis Ross's recent comments and research on this. I'm not a Syria expert. I have some background in how the U.S. looks at problems, though. First of all, we have to deal with the balance of power that is keeping this civil war, and it is a civil war, in basically an impasse. We need to throw our weight behind the forces that will push Assad to leave and to form a new government that is more representative of the people of Syria. To do so, there are a variety of ideas out there. Train and equip, which is an idea that I think we will move to sooner or later, better the sooner than later. But there are other things we could do. We're very concerned, as we should be, about giving Stinger weapons to various groups, and we don't know who they are and what will happen to those weapons. At some point, we could put some of our own people in there who are trained in them to keep possession of those weapons and to use them rather than turning them over to other people. No-fly zones have been discussed. I've talked to military people. There are many complicated issues related to them. I was involved in them in Kuwait and in Turkey for 6 years against Iraq. There are problems, but they're a very effective tool, and there are a variety of ways to do a less conventional no-fly zone that will, again, show that America is taking the lead. To some degree, while it is important what we do, it's also equally important at this point, when the whole region is looking at us, that we do something. And right now, we're really not doing anything. And that's what's troubling me, because that's so unusual in my experience with the U.S. government. Sometimes, and I've been there and seen that, we do the wrong thing, but we really do nothing. And this is having a real effect, eroding the credibility that we have in the region. At the end of the day, most of the countries in the region, whether officially and openly or behind closed doors, look at the United States as a friend, as a counselor, as someone that they can count on when things go south. That is an important thing. In your own lives, you all know how important it is. Your word, your credit, your reliability in everything you do, in business and in private life. It's the same thing in foreign relations. We've built this up over decades. Things like Desert Storm, things like the Surge, things like the tanker war against Iran. We've shown that when things really get shaky in the Middle East, we can be counted on. People are asking questions now, and we need to answer them. The second thing we need to do to complement the most important thing, which is to change the balance, is to work on the humanitarian issues that Prince Zeid mentioned, involving not only his country, but particularly the internally displaced in Syria. It is a hell on earth there today. And anything we can do, we should do, and we should take credit for it. I say that as one who knows what happened when we took credit for USAID projects in Iraq and people were killed. Nonetheless, this is politically dramatic. We have to take credit for the actions we do, and we have to take more actions. The third thing, and again, Prince Zeid referred to this, is to watch the spillover of this conflict into the region. We had the same problem in the Balkans. The thing that we wanted to avoid, and in the end we basically did, was to block the struggles in Bosnia, the struggles in Kosovo, from becoming an Orthodox Muslim conflict throughout the whole region, pulling in potentially, and this was our worst scenario, Turkey and Greece on either side. By the same token, we have to ensure that what's going on in Syria does not become a Sunni-Shia conflict. That would immediately have tremendous impact, even more than the war has today, on Lebanon, and the impact on Iraq, which I know pretty well, would be not to be calculated. And that is of great importance, because much of the new oil that will come globally in the next decade, 45% of it is to come from Iraq. It is extremely important, including a new pipeline with Jordan. It is, as the Prince said, there are all kinds of second and third order reactions to any action that is taken. But inaction is a kind of action, and it's not a good one. We need to focus on this more. We need to continue to build these coalitions and to have this deep and detailed review that we have not had up till now. Now, question is, what are the problems if we do engage more with Syria? And there are a number. First of all, Americans are tired of decade-long, 150,000 troop, trillion-dollar exercises in trying to bring democracy and rule of law to places in the Middle East. Having spent 3 years trying to do that myself in Iraq, I have some sympathy with that line of reasoning. It's very, very hard. It may not work. If our prerequisite for going into Syria is the people we support have to be Jeffersonian Democrats, they have to sign up and live an agenda that Norwegians would sign up to, we're not going to find few friends, and we're going to be stuck having to actually affect a situation that we were not able to affect in Afghanistan or Iraq to a great degree. So we have to be very careful on that. The second thing we have to worry about is the reaction, again, as the Prince said, of the other players. There are three that are very important related to Syria. The first is Iran. Iran sees its outreach to the Mediterranean, its role as a major player, as a strategic player in the Mediterranean. Remember, these are the guys who marched to Marathon 500 years before our era. These are people who feel themselves a Mediterranean power. And their bridge is Syria. Without Syria, Hezbollah would be in a dangerous situation and would be much less likely to provide the short-range artillery support to Iran in any conflict with Israel. So that's very important to cut that link. But Iran is liable to react very, very aggressively if we're not careful. On the other hand, under better circumstances, if we're on top of the situation, this can provide further pressure on Iran as we face them down in the nuclear year that we have in front of us. Russia and China are also of concern. Rightly or wrongly, and I think absolutely wrongly, they believe that everything America has done in the world since 1999 in Kosovo represents regime change to knock out people that like Russia and buy their weapons, and to some degree like China, for people who like us. No, it doesn't quite work that way. Basically, they wind up supporting the bad actors in the world because we won't sell weapons to the bad actors. We sell weapons to the good actors, so the bad actors have only one place to go for weapons and support, and that's Moscow and secondarily Beijing. And so therefore, they wind up supporting the worst elements in the international neighborhood. And if we're going to be true to our values, we have to take these people on. And that means at times getting crossways with the Russians and the Chinese. That's inevitable, but we have to be aware that that's going to have to happen. And how we manage those two countries, not only in the context of Syria, but also in the context of the Iranian P5+1 negotiations, possible UN condemnation, further condemnation of Iran, possible support or at least not an effort to block American military action. These are all important as well. But at the end of the day, a Syria that stays under the control of Assad and the Iranians spells very, very bad news for everything we're trying to do with Iran, everything we're trying to do to secure our friends from Turkey and Israel to the Gulf in that region. And this is a very, very serious issue, and we need to focus on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, you just heard from Jim an impassioned call for American action. You heard earlier a very reasoned request from Zeid for at least a common understanding among the regional players. I'd like to open this discussion session with a question about a word that we haven't heard at all so far, and it's or a concept that sort of hovers over any discussion about the future of Syria, and that is Islamists. Change in the Middle East, we thought began with Tahrir Square, and it ended up with Mohammed Morsi. And change in Syria began with some horrific attacks on kids in the town of Dera, who happened to just do some graffiti on a wall in this small southeastern town across the border from Jordan. And it appears as though it is ending up with Jabhat al-Nusra, a radical Islamist terrorist group that has announced that it is really al-Qaeda in disguise, or not even in disguise anymore. How should we think of change in Syria in terms of what it will mean for our interests? How should we think of what change will mean if one of the options of change is to empower groups, movements, organizations that may be antithetical to our interests and our values? And to be a total devil's advocate, the devil we know is Bashar al-Assad. Merciless, bloody dictator, willing to kill tens of thousands of his own people. Better or worse than the devil we don't know? Gentlemen?
All right, yeah. I'm going to totally avoid that question by basically saying, I mean, the fundamental problem that exists in terms of how the Arab Spring has unfolded, maybe not a problem, but it's just a fact, really, is that when you compare it to the European revolutions of 1848, there was no, in the Arab case, no authentic Arab liberal philosophy or philosopher that could provide a voice for the aspirations of the young that were in Tahrir Square and that marched in many of the capitals throughout the Middle East. In other words, if you were to extol the virtues of Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, you would be immediately labeled as an importer of Western philosophical thought, and that as a counterpoise to the indigenous ideologies that exist in the Middle East, whether they be the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Takfiri groups, basically it was shallow. And in the absence of there being a authentic Arab liberal philosophical sort of a school of thinking, you only have those two sort of authentic voices, because the leftists by and large have been defeated. The Ba'ath Party has been is now in Syria, on its last legs perhaps. In Iraq it has gone. And so there is no countervailing other force. And like with the Jacobins in France from 1791 to 1793, the tendency is that if things don't work, it's not because, where are the liberals? It's because those who are running the show perhaps weren't Islamic enough. And that's the sort of trajectory that we're on, to answer your question, Rob. In other words, this is what we have throughout the Arab world. And so for the young who say we want to be like, we want to be like a Scandinavian country, or we want to be like a Northern European country, the US, it's just mimicry. You can't found political parties on this stuff. And you can't just, it's aspirational, but it's not grounded in any deeper thinking. And that's the problem that we have. And therefore, we are very prone to other things, a rise in the price of wheat, or price of sugar, or fluctuations of this nature. And then if the government concerned can't deliver, the tendency would be to move to the extreme rather than to move to the middle or co-opt the more liberal voices. And so that has to be just the general appreciation we have. In Syria, it reminds me of the arguments that Tudjman and Milosevic used to use with us when we were with the UN, when I was with the UN. And that is, and particularly Milosevic, they would say to us, why are you, the international community, or you, the UN, supporting the Bosniaks? I mean, don't you see that they are bent on creating an Islamic republic in the heart of Europe? Don't you see that? And these people are mujahideen, because there were mujahideen in Bosnia. There were actually quite a large number of mujahideen who had come from Afghanistan. And so we have to be careful we don't fall into that sort of logic. I mean, there were, you know, hundreds and thousands of people killed in Bosnia, partly because there was a sort of tendency in the beginning to draw some sort of moral equivalency, that they're all killing each other, they're all terrible, and besides, you know, if you support the Bosnian government too much, they'll just bring in the mujahideen, you know. But there was no moral equivalency at the time, and there was very distinctly one side that was the aggressor, and that's not to say that crimes were not committed on the other side, as is the case in Syria today. But there is a force that's pushing this, and that's very clear in Syria today as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim?
Once again, I agree wholeheartedly with what the Prince has said. But
you're a good man.
You didn't come here to hear an absence of controversy, and I have to say something other than I agree. So I'll try to take a somewhat different tact. This is more what I hope than what I believe, but it perhaps will give us something to chew on for the discussion later. I've served in 3 countries in the Middle East that are more or less democracies and have strong Islamic movements. Kuwait, perhaps the most democratic of the GCC states, with a parliament dominated by Salafists, Muslim Brothers, and Shia leaning towards the clerical worldview. Turkey under Prime Minister Erdogan, whose party has its roots among Muslim brother philosophers, and of course the Iraq of first Prime Minister Jaafari and then Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who are people who come from the Dawa party, which is a religious party, a Shia party. There are a couple of general things I can say, but I would stop by saying this is really complex and it's very hard to generalize. First of all, I'll give you the best case scenario. It would be really hard to take Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and, as another Frenchman pointed out, de Tocqueville, introduce them to the United States, because the United States, while a democratic liberal country, has a very different view of religion than French laicism. And we have found ways to live with a largely religious population of Americans and a government that does not take orders from the clerics. Now, one reason for that is which clerics? We would be confused. But in the Middle East, there's a little bit of that too, including in Iraq and elsewhere. So that's, and certainly in Kuwait, there are 2 major factions, or obviously 2 in Iraq, and now that Turkey is being pulled into the maelstrom of Middle Eastern, to some degree, religious-dominated politics, people are pointing out that there are an awful lot of Alawites and even more Alevis in Turkey too. So what does this all mean? So to some degree, these countries as states face the same problem that we had in America in 1789, which is you don't have just one religion. There's no Church of England that rules. So therefore, perhaps you want to separate the personal lives of people, including their theological, religious lives, from the public life of the society. There's a lot of thinking, including among the people close to those leaders I mentioned in these countries. It's no accident that Prime Minister Erdogan, when he went to Egypt recently, told them that the secular state is important, using, again, the Turkish word borrowed from the French secularists, laicism. And that was a bit of a surprise for me, knowing him the way I do, but he did say it. And to some degree, we're going to have to hope that there will be a confrontation between the more radical elements and the less radical. I think, frankly, that the al-Nusra organization made a huge strategic mistake, as did the al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan, by accepting them as a bona fide member of al-Qaeda. You saw the immediate reaction, not only by the other elements of the Syrian resistance, but even by the al-Nusra people themselves. Well, we really didn't mean it, and no, let's think about this again. Being a radical Islamist has a lot of downsides, not just to us on the outside, but to many people in the region. So that's the upbeat version of this. But you can take a much grimmer view of what's going on, and to open the door to that, I'll have to say that, and this is from my experience in these countries, democracy is not just voting. Democracy is having a feeling that at the end of the day, winning and losing are important, but most important is playing by the rules, is pluralism, is rule of law, is fighting corruption, is having many centers of power, division of power, separation of powers, as we do in the United States, perhaps even better than the European models. And that kind of thinking is not too common, even among the more moderate of the people that I've dealt with in this region. So we have to be very careful about this. But on the other hand, we have to ask ourselves, do we really want to stand against both the vast majority of the people and our own values in terms of democracy and the right of the governed to have a say in being governed? Those are hard things to stand against. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Let's open the floor for your questions. Please try to direct your question to one or other of our speakers, and try to keep your question as well as a question. I'll start here with Orna on my right, and the microphone is right on your left.
Thank you. This is directed to the Prince. I had the opportunity to visit your country with Bernard Lewis, and I'm going to refer to him in the question. As you were speaking now and referring to the different philosophers of the 18th and 19th century, he has written about that there was never an enlightenment in the Arab Muslim world. With that, it would lead you to think that the fall of the Ottoman Empire and what Pico and Sykes did might be moving backwards. That my point is, do you think that the states that were created along the whole Levant could return to more of a, if not a de facto tribal associations in the long run, or will it be a governed state as you see today?
Are we seeing the end of the era of the post-World War I era in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, when you look at take the historical view, you know, Enlightenment may have passed us by, but where did it take Europe? It took Europe to a world war and to the destruction of 40 million people in the First War, and then another, you know, equivalent amount in the Second. And as Rob said, we're still living with the consequences of it today. So, you know, there is an argument to be made that perhaps we were lucky that we weren't exposed to that. No, I think the problem is that we simply can't read the script as accurately as we think we can. And I think that one disservice of the 20th century is that with all the scientific advances and technological breakthroughs that we were able to achieve, we began to think that we knew a lot of the answers to many of the questions which we still have no clue about. You know, it's sort of hubris and conclusion, which is really only conjecture. You know, and the fact of the matter is, we're not prophets. We basically take stabs in the dark. We don't really know as much as we should. And one assumes that the Middle East is in a state of transformation. What it will eventually look like, one doesn't really know, I don't think. Because the impression is also that we're approaching something sort of big, that this belt of crises that goes from sort of Afghanistan all the way through the Middle East and then to Sudan, that it's so filled with tension and filled with problems that you can envisage a few things happening where suddenly you have a huge regional emergency, you know, beyond our ability to control at all. So, you know, it's difficult to say. I mean, if I can be completely depressing, you know, you know, when you look at the world today, we celebrate every time Samsung comes out with a G3 or Apple comes out with because there's no big idea to celebrate. There are no huge giants in moral philosophy we celebrate. There's nothing grand anymore. So Samsung comes out with something, we worship the Samsung machine. You know, we worship the tablet that comes out and makes our children happy. And so we're rather derelict in that sense. You know? And the world is just drifting towards something. We sense it could be potentially very big because there's a lot of fissile material potentially around, a lot of chemical agents that are so lethal, and I don't think most people are aware of how lethal these things are. And we just merrily go from one day to another, hoping that it doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. But as President Obama said at the Washington Conference on Nuclear Security, it's going to happen. And so I think we have to be seized with all of this, and I think we have to be aware of what's happening and try as best as we can to offer reasonable conjecture and to always be humble and not assume it's too much conclusion.
I think by popular demand, we're going to leave the bar open an extra hour this evening. In the back, Richard Abramson.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for the presentation. Do you think that the players in the Middle East are rational and that you can deal with them, that they will make a rational decision? And I'll let you decide which players. And then, Mr. Jeffries, you had mentioned that the president did not want to take action in Syria. I may have missed as to the reason why.
Jim, you want to start?
Let me start with the question of the president. I think that the way he would put it is that America spent the last decade in 2 wars in the broader Middle East, that between them cost us now 6,500 American military personnel killed, a couple of $1 trillion, and we don't see the kind of transformational change we had hoped for and had seen elsewhere in the region. So he's very reluctant to get involved in yet another war when he believes that much of America's power in the world, and I think he's somebody that supports power in the world. I would give you his Nobel Peace Prize speech, needs to focus on building up our economic and social infrastructure here in the United States. I agree with him on all of that, but I'm not an advocate for 150,000 troops in Damascus for a decade. I'm an advocate for drones plus, or whatever the hell it will take to do this job on a relative financial shoestring. We've done this so many times. We did it in the Balkans. We didn't put infantry on the ground until nobody was shooting anymore. In Bosnia, we only put a small force on the ground in Kosovo, again, after the shooting stopped. There are models for how to do this. This doesn't have to be Somalia. It doesn't have to be Beirut 1983. These are all, so my feeling is that he got perhaps bad advice. Look, if you go in there, you're stuck. You never get out, or you retreat in disarray. Not so. You just have to be smart. He's got a lot of people around him who are smart and who are paid to be smart, and I think we should listen to them.
And let me ask both of you Richard's first question. From your experience, and we don't have to name names here, although names would be great. When we use the term rational, have the leaders that you've dealt with, do they operate rationally, and more specifically, is their sense of rationality the same as our sense of rationality?
But I mean, it depends on what basic premises you're working on. I mean, because the centenary of the First World War is almost upon us. I mean, a lot of us are reading now about the First World War, so we like to refer to it a great deal. But I mean, I'm sure that when Tsar Nicholas II partially mobilized his army, it was a rational decision. You know, that had he known that the German General Staff would have jumped all over this as the excuse they needed and wanted to begin preparations that led to the First World War, maybe he wouldn't have, mobilized. So it all depends on the range of. I think that everyone is rational, but the base of knowledge may be very narrow, and so that's why I think we need to all. I mean, if you ask me, this should have happened a long time ago. The neighbors need to all sit together and decide that, well, it's in the interest of all of us that Syria remains whole. We don't want to see a sectarian breakup. It's in the interest of all of us that we're not threatened by chemical weapons. It's in the interest of all of us that we find an end to this conflict with the least number of casualties. And if we decided, all the neighbors, on a common set of issues, then we can sort of perhaps bring down the temperature, but it hasn't happened yet.
I agree. Again, I would say that it depends on how you define rational. My experience, not just in the Middle East, but my experience in my own government, is that the rational kind of looks like the movie The Godfather much more than the Federalist Papers. That we have this idealized view of what rational thinkers are, that there are these godlike people who only think in brilliant, balanced, non-selfish terms about the big issues, whereas rightly or wrongly, I can tell you that my experience with several different administrations at the very top is they're people just like you and me, and they're going to be responding the same way we respond, sometimes rationally, sometimes not. Sometimes they just get angry at somebody, and they're not going to do what that person says, no matter whether it makes sense or not. Rationalism has nothing to do with it. He or she wants it, so I don't want it. This is the kind of thing, I'm talking about the U.S. government now, not the Middle East. And so in the Middle East, I find if you can go in and have good arguments, you can sit down with the devil and say, look, you want to keep your hell at 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit? You're going to need gas, buddy, and we have friends who will sell you gas if you do this and that. But if you go in there and say, you have to do these things because we are part of an international order that is good and that is adhering to the UN Charter of 1945. And this is good for your people to do what we Americans from the outside are telling you to do. I find they don't listen. So if that's irrational, believe me, they're irrational.
Just on Jim's last comment, you think that you joke. I remember about a year ago having a conversation with a very high-ranking Russian official late one night about Syria, and after I think it was the second vodka or whatever, he said, you really want to understand Russian policy? It's very simple. You Americans screwed us in Libya, we Russians will screw you back in Syria. That's it. Everything else is commentary. Now, maybe he's right. Maybe it was just the second vodka. I don't know. Josh Weston in front. You got to take the microphone. It's right behind you on your right.
Thanks, Rob. I'd like to address my comments to Ambassador Jeffrey in order to, not comments, question. In order to pose the question, I think it accurately begins that almost everything we heard, very discouraging, very indeterminate. There is no clear end game. There is no clear process with high confidence. But, and now I get to the question, unless you tell me that you don't think Iran, directly and indirectly, is the biggest troublemaker in this area, I ask you to answer the following question about Iran, whose definition of negotiation is, if we talk about anything, we'll talk about when the next meeting will be, and now we're done with this meeting. So they are snookering us while they export oil. I'm laying the basis for the question.
Josh.
It gives them the money to buy all kinds of stuff, which may also be a nuclear bomb. So all kinds of dangers and different sects and everything. Given that Iran is the most ill-wishing, powerful entity there, what is your comment to the following? Rob's heard this question already. They're not bowing to the current weak sanctions. Why shouldn't, in your opinion, I'm not asking Obama now, why shouldn't the United States declare a harmless act of war that kills absolutely nobody, even though it's an act of war? Hey, Grand Ayatollah, unless you get off all your bad kicks, you will not export oil and you will not import anything, and all we need is the U.S. Navy. We don't need any cooperation, because all the past stuff isn't stopping the most dangerous troublemaker in the Middle East. So my question is, why not a harmless act of war, blockade?
First of all, to answer your question, I do think Iran is the biggest problem in the region, and I see Syria to some degree through the prism of Iran as an ally of Iran's. At some point, it may come to that, but I think if it does, it would not be a bloodless blockade, because they would challenge the blockade. They have very extensive capabilities to challenge the blockade, and we would be in a major fight. So I think that the answer that the Obama administration would give is, you know, we think the sanctions bite. They've cut their oil exports by more than 50%. That might change. We have to watch China there. But they have cut the oil sanctions. They have other ways to export. Financially, they may be able to survive. They may not. They may decide to cut a deal with us. I'm kind of skeptical, but I think that as we did with Saddam in late 1990, early 1991, we worked well in that campaign, and we worked well in the campaign, the tanker war against Iran before, because we built up international support and we built up international justification and, to some degree, concrete support, troops, money, particularly in the first Iraq war, but to some degree also even the Russians supported us in the tanker war. And that gives us a great deal of leverage, including with the American people. When the going gets tough, the American people like to see American allies, and they like to see where this trip is going. So I think that my recommendation would be you hold with these sanctions, you try to toughen them a little bit. If they will not negotiate, at the end of the day, we may have to choose between a military action to take out the nuclear sites, or something like a blockade, but either the military strike on the sites or a blockade will probably lead to an Iranian military attack on us and on our allies in the region, and that's just the reality.
Zeid, can you, I wanted to ask if you could just give us a little glimpse of how the Syria discussion actually goes in the UN. It's a remarkable issue that, I mean, to the extent that you can talk about this, where one or two countries block international action on Syria, and the numbers of casualties and victims just continues to rise. How do these discussions actually happen?
Okay, before I get to it, I just want to quickly touch on Josh's point. When I was working on Liberia and West Africa a few years ago, you know, it occurred to me that you take any commodity that is being smuggled around the world, and you realize it's a thriving business, that the abilities of governments to contain the flow of illegal, you know, merchandise, whether it be cocaine, whether it be human trafficking, whatever it is actually not as great as people assume it to be. Now, once you get this once we think about this, you realize that, you know, the Iranians, if they haven't done it already, I'm sure they would, is just squirrel away, you know, small amounts of fissile material and then make it available to groups. And then enough smuggling routes that are very active that governments can't control, and you know, the region becomes, if not already dangerous, becomes even more so, because they'll bring it to your doorstep. So that's on one point. On the UN, last year there were 5 small countries. We called ourselves the Small Five. We presented a resolution in the General Assembly. And basically the resolution, the key part of it was that we asked for the permanent members not to exercise the use of veto if there was credible evidence that genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity were being committed. And we put the war crimes between crimes against humanity and genocide, because those two crimes are the jus cogens crimes, as we call them, and so this war crimes had to be up to that threshold. And I got a call from one ambassador, and they were furious. This is from a permanent member. And I did point out that Secretary Clinton at the time did call the previous Russian veto used in respect of Syria as despicable. But then it raises the broader question, well then, the veto itself has to be looked at, because it doesn't inspire, it doesn't create anything. The veto just blocks action. It's dull, it's dead, it's dumb, essentially. It just blocks. And it would be a great help to all of us if the country exercising the use of veto were to say, okay, I'm using the veto here, I'm blocking you, but I have another proposal, and I think this really works, and I think we can do something. And so you find the UN is utterly hamstrung now and paralyzed on the issue of Syria. And the Security Council can't even come up with a press statement. The weakest form of a reaction it can't come up with. But then when is it time for the Council to act? When already the whole region and beyond is consumed by something beyond our imagination, and then they'll come in and step in. I mean, it's sort of it begs questions.
Barbara Lafer in the front.
I'd like to ask the Prince, what needs to happen for the countries of the region to get together and have a common understanding of what needs to be done in Syria, as you described? You said it hasn't happened. What needs to happen?
I mean, I'd be exceedingly arrogant to say they need to listen to me, but no,
we do that all the time. That's why we're in business.
No, if you look at the wars in Bosnia, or the war in Bosnia, what was evident there is that the international community was looking for solutions, but keeping the neighborhood out. So Croatia and Serbia were essentially out of the equation in terms of what the international community was trying to do there, which was naive because they were going to be involved. They were going to be involved anyway, so you might as well co-opt them into the solution. And what you notice now is that there's all sorts of thinking that if there is a ceasefire, or if there is a political agreement and there's some movement toward transition, maybe there's a space for the UN to get in. And if the UN gets in, we don't dare call in the neighboring countries because they have their agendas. And I think that would be a mistake. I think the thing is, we need to be involved because we all have a stake. And most of the countries, if not all, have the fear of the same thing, the same things. But because we're not at that state of regional maturity, let's say, to do this sort of thing, and we're all preoccupied with the here and now, the day-to-day, and we're looking at it very narrowly at how these threats affect us individually as states, and not regionally. And I think it's a commentary on the sad state of the world that this is how we are. We don't look beyond tomorrow to sort out the problems. We really don't. And it's just how we can find a fix for tomorrow's issue, and that's the state that we're in. When I look at this audience, we're all mature, but I say this to younger audiences when I go to schools, and because what we're leaving them is tragic. These young kids, what we're leaving them, and we go off and we have our vacations and we're happy, but what sort of world are we leaving to them? It's really shameful that we expect them to clear up all the mess that we're forcing upon their shoulders in a few years' time.
Yes, sir, right here.
There was a press report 3 hours ago by Reuters that the U.S. would be sending 200 troops to Jordan. It was announced by the Jordanian information minister. Is that a development, maybe of now engagement?
Yeah, I hadn't heard about that. So I mean, we have plenty of mutual exercises year in, year out. So I don't know whether this is something special and new, or it's just a regular sort of training, joint training exercise. But we have frequent exercises together. So.
Great. We'll take just two more questions right here, and then in the way back. I'm sorry. We'll squeeze you in. Yes. Go ahead.
To both of the panelists, the Prince first, what would be the reaction of the Jordanian government if the Israelis unilaterally attacked Iran and or Syria to destroy nuclear capability and or chemical weapons? And Ambassador, what do you see the reaction to the rest of the Arab world if Israel took unilateral action in both those cases?
Great, thank you. In the way back, please.
How would the U.S. look at the same thing if Israel struck Iran? So I'll take that.
Yeah, please.
Hi. Two quick questions. I was a bit surprised by the pessimism towards the Arab Spring. It only happened yesterday. If you take a look historically, even the U.S. Revolution, the French Revolution, it took quite some time until it stabilized, crystallized, and governments were formed. I mean, the U.S. not until 1812, the French not until Napoleon. I was trying to understand the pessimism. And then I was also a bit confused about the advocation of the U.S. moving into Syria. We don't have a good history of intervening. I mean, historically, from Korea, we got North Korea. Vietnam was a fiasco. Our most recent attempts of Iraq, I don't think we have very many friends there. Afghanistan needs no commentary. Libya, we've left weapons moving all around Africa. I mean.
Okay, I think we got the question. Okay, and yes, up here, please, right in front. Here you go.
Mindful of the fact that speakers don't often get to choose the topic, I'm nonetheless struck by the topic for this evening, the death of Syria, which carries with it a freight of implications that at the conclusion of hostilities there may or may not be a country as we know it. And I wonder whether either or both of you would like to comment on that particular question.
Very good. Okay, gentlemen, an opportunity to answer these questions and also to look a little bit forward in terms of where you think the end game may in fact end up in Syria. Jim, you want to go first?
Okay, running down the list, I think that the Arab countries would react to a strike on Iran by Israel initially the same way they reacted to the Israeli attack on Hezbollah in 2006 in Lebanon. That is, they would quietly cheer on Israel. I think that that could change very dramatically if Iran then retaliated against some of the places where we have bases, which is essentially everywhere in the Middle East. And if it turns into a very messy conflict where they're endangered, then they will lash out at us, at the Israelis, and at everybody else. But their initial, Iran does not have many friends in the region. Pessimism about the Arab Spring. You know, you're right. But why are we, if you're right, why are we pessimistic? I'll tell you why. Because this thing was greeted with so much overflowing enthusiasm rather like 1989 in Eastern Europe, only even more so. We were very worried about 1989. I was on the ground. It took us many months to figure out whether we really wanted to have East Germany go away. This was very tough. Think of Margaret Thatcher. Think of Mitterrand. Think of, frankly, a lot of people in the White House. We weren't sure about this. We were nervous as hell. Whereas when the Arab Spring broke out, everybody was saying, see, we knew it would happen. This is all going to be just terrific. Well, it's not going to be as terrific as we thought, but as I said, we can deal with most of these people. I have hope that the guys who and girls who wind up on top are going to be people that we can cut deals with. But they're not going to be people who are going to do whatever we say, and they're not going to be people who are going to make us happy every day in terms of human rights, in terms of rejecting religious influences, and in terms of dealing with minorities, and in terms of some of the foreign policy issues. At the end of the day, Egypt is still in a peace treaty with Israel. It still is pushing against the Salafist elements in the society, and that's good news. But again, as I said, I think that my knee-jerk reaction of poo-pooing the Arab Spring is because people embraced it too powerfully at the beginning. I'm glad you raised the question about there'll be no country. What does this mean? Because earlier there was a question about Sykes-Picot, and does this going to mean the end of it? And of course, in Iraq, subject number 1, 2, and 3 on all 3 of my years there was, is this country going to hold together? Let me make a plaidoyer for Sykes-Picot. It was bad that people from the outside drew these artificial lines in the sand separating religions and groups and all of that without much rhyme or reason other than where armies were and who wanted what booty at the end of World War I. But the point is, that's not how Europe did it in the colonial world. That's how Europe did it in the Westphalian Peace, too. All of those boundaries that we now call the European Union are totally irrational. You go to the museum in Strasbourg and you find that everybody there spoke German until about 1750. And then they started taking on names like Valérie and Veronique, rather than Brunhilde and Gerhild, because they had no choice. It was illegal to be called Siegfried anymore. And this is the nature of these things. And I kind of think this is the world that we live in. It has a lot of structure to it. There's a reason that Westphalia became Westphalia, and they set up nation states with all of the trappings of sovereignty and no outside interference and all of that. Because if you don't have those very strict, legally binding, anchored in international law limits, everybody is always messing in everybody else's backyard, which was the history of Europe culminating in the 30 Years' War that led to the Westphalian Peace, that led to lines being drawn in the forests, not in the sands, that led to the lines being drawn in the sand in the Middle East. I think that in the end, probably Syria, just like Iraq, will remain a independent, unified country, not because there's any particular rationale for that particular group of people to be inside that nation state, but because we can't deal with the implications if everybody starts erasing all of the borders in the Middle East any more than they could in the 17th century in Europe, or they can in Africa, even more irrational borders that are pretty much holding up. So I'll leave it at that. In terms of the end game, we're going to get involved in Syria one way or another. We are doing some planning for it. We should do more. We should be more aggressive, but we will get dragged in. In terms of the very good question, but why should we? We haven't done well. This is a philosophical question. A few things really went badly, Vietnam being the best example. Iraq, mixed bag. I can argue it both ways. Korea, I would argue, was a major victory for us in the long run, but with a lot of blunders, like trying to march on North Korea, for example. And that's the way we do foreign policy. That's the way everybody else does foreign policy. It's always mixed. It's always debatable. There is no final answer. The Cuban Missile Crisis is now being looked at again, and people are saying, no, Kennedy spun all of us. It really wasn't such a brilliant idea. Well, I don't know. I think that in the end, who won the Cold War? We won the Cold War. So we did enough things right. And in the end, we're going to win whatever we were going to call this whole period after 1989, because we're going to do enough things right. Thank you.
Zeid, you get the last word, and then I'll just have a couple of closing remarks.
It's my turn to agree with Jim on a number of things. Reaction to any attack on Iran, I think we would be very worried simply because we don't think it's neat and tidy and it all can be done. And you sort of tie up the loose knots at the end of it. I think the dangers that would accrue would almost outweigh what we presently face. And again, you know, these small amounts of fissile material, they can be made available. And if I can tell you some of the stories that we know about how this material, not from the Middle East, but outside the Middle East, how it's gone missing from enrichment plants and how it can easily cross borders. You know, there's so many other dangers there that we can't simplify it just to the way that we do. Arabs being too pessimistic. I don't think it's a question of pessimism. I think it's a question of can we cope? Can we cope? If the unpredictability or the lack of predictability becomes ever more acute, you know, how do we cope as governments? I mean, we can't cope. You know, look at how when Cyprus, the two banks, you know, were on the brink of collapse. The European Union for 1 week couldn't do anything else except sort out a problem. And the funny thing was that I saw some material on the Cypriot banks 6 months ago, and then yet no one saw this coming, you know, at least not the European governments. And now everyone's aware about Slovenia. And if you focus on Slovenia, the European Union is no. So we just can't cope with what we have. And already the region is exceedingly tense. On the US, that I think Jim answered that. Death of Syria. I mean, I did notice, of course, the question mark. And there was a very good piece in The Guardian about what does it mean. You know, even if Damascus were to be leveled, one thing you notice about the great cities of the world is that they persist. Civilizations come and go, people come and go, countries come and go. Every major city in Europe has been burnt to the ground and sacked at some stage, but they still exist. You know, Krakow is still there. You know, Paris is still there. I mean, you can. So if Damascus is a core to the Syrian identity, Syria will somehow always exist, but whether this configuration of the country, you know, I think one, of course, doubts that that would be the case, and the country would be transformed into something else. Thank you.
Well, first, let me thank both of my colleagues. I didn't expect that we'd have a discussion that touched on Jean-Jacques Rousseau or the Westphalian system of modern states, but the breadth and depth of the discussion by people who every day deal with life and death issues, I think was really, really remarkable. I think we heard tonight some of the profound complications of dealing in a multilateral, multinational way with the conflict in Syria and the frustration that we heard. I think we also heard a plea from a very seasoned guy in the field for more American leadership. I'm always struck by the remarks, by the statement, Americans are war weary, which is absolutely true, of course. We were war weary and we were isolationist on the eve of World War I, and we were isolationist on the eve of World War II. And the only thing that got us involved in both of these conflicts was leadership, a variable that Jim referred to, which is an essential variable in all forms of foreign policy. I don't think we've heard the end of the Syria story. And, you know, it's sort of very trite to say it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I fear that very much is the reality that we all face. And I do agree that in the end there will be a Syria, that this is a provocative question, but it is just a question, it's not a statement. I should say, as an aside, we all have to put in our own 2 cents in favor of drawing lines on the map Otherwise, where would the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan be? And I think, and you know, thank God for the people who did draw the lines on the map, because the Middle East is a world of states today, and not really just a world of tribes, as some people say. So let me thank my colleagues. Let me thank Jim. Let me thank Zeid. Let me thank all of you for being here.